to 7 o'clock.
Yeah.
You want to go watch it?
Yeah. Yeah, we could.
Hold on 1 second. All right, y'all, we're starting our event here for the month of May. And I'm Adam, and one of the members of the editorial board of the Virginia Worker. And just want to welcome you all to the 6th event of the year for the Virginia Worker. We have many more events to come. We hope you will continue to join us as we host guest speakers presenting on a range of topics covering the history of the Virginia working class and other relevant topics for Virginia workers. Our goal as the Virginia Worker team is to build a distinctly pro-worker and independent ideological pole of attraction for the Virginia working class, which otherwise does not exist. We're comprised of groups across the state who emphasize organizing workers independently from capitalist parties and their auxiliary organizations, which promote a class collaborationist agenda to the detriment of Virginia workers. Our website is meant to popularize the struggles, campaigns, reports, and debate across the state affecting Virginia workers. We welcome all contributions that fall in line with our mission statement, which you can find at thevirginiaworker.com. Now on to tonight's presenter. We have Dr. Daniel Sayers, who's an associate professor of anthropology at American University in Washington, D.C. As a historical archaeologist, Sayers has analyzed and interpreted many archaeological sites across the U.S. through landscape perspectives that are informed by his Marxist approach and orientation. He is the author of many academic articles. He has made numerous media appearances, and he has worked with several museums on archaeological exhibits. Sayers is the author of the book, A Desolate Place for a Defiant People, The Archaeology of Maroons, Indigenous Americans, and Enslaved Laborers in the Great Dismal Swamp. And his book, Historical Archaeology of the Home and Unhomed, will be out in early 2023. Dr. Sayers is a native of Michigan, grew up in Detroit metro area, and more recently lived in Williamsburg and Richmond while working on his doctorate at William & Mary. I'm going to pass it off to Mike here to go over the ground rules.
Sure. So in terms of ground rules, what's going to happen is Dr. Sayers is going to deliver his presentation, and then we're going to open up the floor to questions. If you have a question, you can just type that in the chat box, and then we will relay those questions to Dr. Sayers after the end of the presentation. Before we get started, I do have a couple of announcements. The first of which is the next Virginia Worker event is going to be June 8th. With some members of SEIU Local 512, which includes city workers who are going to be talking about their fight for collective bargaining, city workers here in Richmond. And the next announcement that I have is the Henrico Educators Association is going to have a rally for salary transparency and retention equity. That is going to be this Thursday, May 26th at 6 p.m. And the address for that is 5915 9 Mile Road in Henrico at the Newbridge Auditorium.
Great, thanks, Mike. Without further ado, we'll pass it on to Dr. Sayers.
All right. Well, thank you all for joining tonight, and thanks, Will, and the editorial team there, or the board at the Worker, for the invitation to present. So I do have, I think it'll be a fairly action-packed slideshow here for you in terms of images and content. So I'll jump right into it. Like was mentioned, we'll have time for question and answers if there's some murky areas. I tend to forget something in the course of one of these presentations, so absolutely ask any questions, and I will do my best to answer them according to what I know. But let me share the screen here, and we'll get started with the kind of content or the slideshow. Let me make sure I can do this right. Let's see here. Oh, share. How's that? Y'all seeing my screen or me again?
Yep, you're good.
Okay, from the beginning. Let's see if this works. All right, how's that? Before I get started, all good? Okay, so this is the cover of the book in question. Just so you know, in case you happen to see it on a shelf somewhere, that's the thing we're talking about. And really as was mentioned, I'm a historical archaeologist, just in case there are those in attendance here that don't have a sort of specific definition in their mind of what historical archaeology is, or some other reason to want to know. The study, I define it as a study of buried artifacts, architecture, and landscapes from the past 450 years or so. The important thing there to remember there is, right, artifacts are important, of course, but we're also quite interested in this discipline in architecture and the landscapes that humans create in the course of their lifetimes. I also am part of this sort of smaller group in the profession that really kind of defines it also, or in addition, as the critical study of modern world and capitalism and its impacts on peoples and environments of the world. So, this sort of helps you understand where, to an extent, the Marxism and the political economic approach you're going to hear a little bit about, at least for me, might come into play. Particularly today, I'm going to talk to you a bit about the Great Dismal Swamp landscape study. This is something I began when I first pretty much began my doctoral work at the College of William and Mary there. And it's still, in a sense, ongoing. The field work is largely wrapped up as far as my participation in it goes. But nonetheless, archaeology, given what we do, we tend to still analyze materials and so on, and all the data we gather in the field for many moons after we're done with actual field work. So in any case, consider it ongoing, and it's something in the order of 2 decades old now. And through it, I've explored, along with many of my colleagues and students, right, the lives and society of the Dismal, with focus on resistance and worker communities that formed and interacted in the sort of post-Jamestown, pre-Civil War era. The book that we're talking about today is the first book from this project. So what I'm going to do here is just give you occasionally the sort of opening page of each chapter from the book, and then I'm going to do my best to give you some key points from each of those chapters, just to give you a sense of what's in the book, but of course also how I'm thinking even to this day. The first chapter really tries to situate the reader to get some sense of what the swamp is sort of like back in the past as well as today. So I'll just read a little bit from this page, see how this goes. But along the western edge of the Great Dismal Swamp National Wildlife Refuge, Desert Road runs north to south along the backbone of the Nansemond or Suffolk Scarp. The Nansemond Scarp is a geological formation, an escarpment, that stands on average perhaps 20 feet above the Dismal Swamp itself. Several ancient drainages cut through it perpendicularly, helping direct tens of thousands of gallons of water into the morass each year. As one travels south along Desert Road, whose narrowness is reminiscent of the rural roads of southwestern Ireland and elsewhere, the sylvan wall that defines the western edge of the swamp is just off to the left. The Dismal Swamp always seems to be within reach out and touch it distance. And then here's just going to be a series of photos. Now, we just mentioned this sort of tree wall, right? At least that's sort of how I've experienced it as you're driving, at least south. It's on your left along that western edge. But once you go into the swamp, for those that haven't been in, it has this series. These photos will give you a sense of the appearance, and really even hopefully a little bit of a sense of what it might be like to experience it, again, if you haven't been out there yourself. All right, now this first photo shows the classic sort of swamp in front, and if you look toward the rear of the photo, you start to see some brown. Those are leaves on the ground. So the water here gives way to some dry ground back there. This dry ground, as we'll repeatedly mention and explore here, is quite important to the history and the people that we're going to talk about today. Right here is actually part of it's on the way into a particular site. Again, we'll hear more about it, but this also gives you a sense of not only what the swamp looks like, but here's some students that worked with me a handful of summers back, making their way right through that swamp. It's on this particular occasion, maybe knee deep in this area, the water that is. Okay, and just to give a feel. This is the swamp today, obviously. It was a bit different in the past, especially before the Civil War, but nonetheless, it's quite similar to what it would have been like before the Civil War. Okay, again, more water. The water is quite dark, even when you're standing right in it and above it and looking down in it. Even with sunshine, it is rather dark. Underneath that water is a natural layer of peat. It's got its own name, the Dismal swamp peat. It's unique in the world, reaching depths of even 20 feet, 25 feet in parts of the swamp. Okay, more students walking through. That's the human forms and colors you see there that aren't green. And then a little red flagging tape there, just to give you a point that we have to even mark our way when we know where we're going. All right, now a little different in the middle of the swamp, so to speak, but almost literally, is Lake Drummond, one of 2 natural lakes in Virginia. It's only a handful of feet deep, on the order of maybe 6 at the most. Quite often it's more like 2 or 3, but nonetheless, it's a couple miles wide and a couple miles long, north, south, east, west. So it's rather circular in shape. You'll see in a minute. Okay, but it's not all just swampland and lakes, or a lake. We also have 20th century roads. These are more or less 2 tracks. Quite often alongside them, there are modern drainage ditches or canals even, but mostly think of them as ditches. Okay, but that's a means by which you can access certain parts of the swamp, at least get somewhere close to where you want to go by way of these roads. Okay, now again, drawing your attention not so much to the water and that thick understory that's sort of growing up through the water that we saw in a few images, but here we're seeing some actual dry ground. And again, we'll talk more about this, but it really looks, if you just get plopped down right there yourself, you're going to think you're in the woods, right? A fairly typical woods, anywhere you might go. Okay, now giving you a sense more cartographically or by map, right, what we're talking about. If, again, you're not familiar with the Dismal, we're not too far ultimately from Richmond when we're talking about the Dismal Swamp or the Great Dismal. So in the circle, the oval, that's the current National Wildlife Refuge. I'll have a close up here in a minute. But the dotted line you see that's got an odd shape that follows that, what I think of as kind of a peninsula, that's the original extent, as far as I can determine, of the Great Dismal Swamp. And this size, think of it as persisting potentially even more or less, say 90% of this up till the Civil War even. So it was quite a big place for the most of the period, if not all the period that I'll be talking about here today in a minute. Okay, now this is a close-up, like I promised, of the current refuge. If you've been to the Great Dismal Swamp State Park of North Carolina, that's right here too. If I had a pointer, I'd point to it, but fear not, that's part of this landscape. But this greened out part is the actual federal property owned by the Fish and Wildlife Service, and that's where I've worked. Okay, just so you know, and I don't have to repeat this, I hope, or I won't forget this and won't repeat it. I worked solely in the Fish and Wildlife Service refuge, and everything we'll be talking about more or less occurs there in terms of the archaeology. But you can see Lake Drummond in the middle. You can also see all these lines you see in that darker gray area. Those are those 2-track roads and adjacent ditches that I mentioned, plus some canals. Several of these were excavated pre-Civil War, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But most of what you see there is post-Civil War and even 20th century, as far as the canals and roads go. So I've hemmed and hawed while putting this discussion together. The book is largely an academic book, and I don't mean that at all in a negative way. It is what I do. But I also know that in conversation and talks, very thick conversation about the deep ideas that academics tend to have to throw at each other, or it can get a little boring, for lack of a better word. So what I'm going to try to do here is fit in some of the key concepts that are in these 2 chapters, right, throughout our discussion here going forward, when we have more tangible things to make connections with. But I do want to read just a little bit of each of these pages, just to give you a sense of a beginning sense of where I went with this analysis. So on the left side, right, chapter 2, alienation, right? I consider it a foundational concept, as the title might suggest. Alienation is among the most analytically and politically significant aspects of life in the modern world or modern world history, and no one did more to clarify this complex significance than Karl Marx. In his view, alienation or estrangement is all things, all individual people, all identities, all social categories, all processes, all commodities, all ideas, and all things social. It dynamically saturates all aspects of human existence and has real social and political economic power throughout modern history. It changes over time within cultures and across space, yet the Marxian conceptualization of alienation has rarely been directly marshaled in historical archaeological analyses, though strangely, there may be a general sense that there is not much potential in the concept or that it is relatively unimportant compared to other aspects of history. And then going over to the right, the architecture of alienation in modern history. Now, in this chapter, what I ended up doing is after laying sort of my ideas of what I think Marxian alienation kind of is, then I translate that into trying to understand real world historical processes as complex manifestations of alienation. So again, reading just a little bit from this chapter 3, human beings by nature are social, creative, and capable of actual real world experience. Furthermore, human beings actively transform the wider world because they are creative. That creativity is intimately connected with human social relations that are situated and actualized within a real material world. People approach the material world that exists before them and around them as social beings who seek to transform that material world to meet human ends. Thus, people make things from the materials of the world within which they are situated. At the same time, sociality is not a simple or even transparent phenomenon. Socialities among human beings take on many different forms across human history, and thus the ways by which humans transform the wider world and its elements, such as stones, plants, earth, and so on, are historically contingent, which means, at least to my mind, right, they happen, but they didn't have to happen that way. It is at this important intersection of human creativity, the wider material world, and human socialities that alienation emerges and is transformed by forces and conditions that arise within historically contingent modes of production. Okay, so now in more bullet point fashion, elaborating a bit on what you might find in those couple chapters, at least that I thought we could at least cover today. All right, looking on the left here of this slide, right, to this book in the project, right, just kind of giving a sense of some of the central sort of people or groups that we've been, or I've been and we've been focusing on. Indigenous Americans, in some ways, right, for quite a long time in terms of what we've looked at and how the people of the ancient world, as you'll see in a few minutes, right, really impacted people of the historical world in many ways. And then AfricanAmerican maroons, and I give you the rough date range there in parens. And just in case it's not clear or you don't know for whatever good reasons, African-American or maroons particularly, I should say, right? Maroons were people who self-removed, or as I say, self-extricated, but removed themselves, or some people would say ran away, right, from conditions of slavery. And this happened anywhere in the world where race-based slavery existed. Scholars have studied it. There are descendant communities around, particularly this hemisphere, that have been well explored by anthropologists and others. But also then, of course, historically, people who removed in the time of their times of slavery, be it in South America, Central America, or here in North America, and also in parts of Africa. In any case, they're quite a phenomenon that's been, again, given their importance, probably understudied, but nonetheless, lots of work has been done across many different professions on sort of understanding them today and in the past. So part of what you're going to hear about, of course, is then the maroons, as I'm arguing anyway, who settled in the Dismal Swamp here in Virginia, North Carolina. And then, of course, at the bottom of the left column there, enslaved African-American canal and lumber laborers, okay? And they are particularly a social aspect of the swamp after about 1763, but all the way up to the Civil War and really the Emancipation Proclamation, really even later. Okay, now in the middle column, right, you already probably got a sense then that alienation or estrangement is a key concept, at least in the book, but certainly in most of my, personally speaking, more broadly in my work to date in the profession, but also modes of production. Marx's ideas of modes of production as sort of a model for understanding societies of the past and, of course, his present. Diasporas, but basically the coerced or forced dispersal of people from their homelands to new homelands, an uneven geographical development, and of course its relation to capital. And this is coming from largely Neil Smith and David Harvey, if you're familiar with those cultural geographers, Marxists. But nonetheless, anyway, it basically explores how the landscapes and spaces and places we see around the capitalist world, right, develop unevenly based on a variety of factors, but the investment of capital and labor as a form of capital, right, is certainly part of that process. And then resistance and defiance, clearly, as seen in the title of the book, but nonetheless also explored a bit in detail what I might mean by that in the pages of the volume. Then on the right, some important concepts in the book. They're kind of themes throughout and are explored in varying ways. But racism and Eurocentricity obviously is not going to be not part of this discussion of this history and these people. Labor, both enslaved and wage, commodities, the production and consumption of them, as well as their fetishization. Community, another big part of the conversation in general. And then, of course, the Marxian, at least Marx's definition or understanding of praxis. All right, now onward towards a discussion of, give you some sense of the people beyond those brief definitions or whatever descriptions from the column slide. The documentary record regarding the inhabitants of the Great Dismal Swamp from the first colonial settlement in the surrounding region up through the Civil War is without question spotty and thin. Nonetheless, in aggregate, the documentary clues and information we have do allow us to establish some basic facts about the cultural swamp landscape and its communities of diasporans. There are a few discussion of indigenous Americans in the historical swamp, while sources begin describing maroons living in the swamp starting in the early 18th century. By the end of that century and into the antebellum 19th century, documentation increases dramatically, relatively speaking. So when we think of who went into the Dismal Swamp in the couple 150 years we'll be talking about, or that I've been exploring all these years, right? We have people representing a variety of indigenous tribes and groups from the wider region. There was a lot of population movement prior to Jamestown. The settlement or the colonial impacts of Jamestown, and certainly in the immediate decades following that. And we expect overall, right, even though we can't quite find all the details we might like in the documentary record, right, but that people from a variety of, again, different tribal and even sort of cultural or ethnic groups among indigenous peoples of the region would have found themselves coming into the swamp. And just as a quick way of saying also, this swamp is also a deeply indigenous space and landscape going back thousands upon thousands of years. But certainly in that closer to that sort of 1607 turning point with the colonialization or colonization of this part of the East Coast, right, it becomes certainly, right, it continues to, but it also becomes place for probably new groups of indigenous peoples, right, as colonial impacts and usurpation of land and so on, right, impacts their homes, and they're compelled one way or another to go back or go to the swamp. There's also, of course, enslaved people of African descent and enslaved laborers, right, after 1619 in the wide region. And if it goes like anywhere else in the world, most would expect, right, that people, some among those enslaved Africans would go to the swamp fairly quickly. So after 1619, I expect personally the first maroons to have gone in within a decade or two, and then the number of maroons going into the swamp to increase dramatically in the decades and centuries that followed. And of course, enslaved Africans and African Americans came from a variety of cultural and traditional backgrounds as well. And so when you think about who is going in the swamp and the cultural ideas and attitudes and understandings and critiques that they're going to bring with them, right, we see that be quite a mix of ideas and understandings, and even things like cosmologies and so on that people would bring to the swamp. And of course, EuroAmericans are a big part of this story as well, not only for the world they helped create in the outside the swamp, but also, how they understood the Dismal. And this is actually a pretty important part of the story in this history. All right, I give you here a quote from Fanny Kimball later in the period that I've been looking at, but it stands in pretty well for most comments that I've seen written across the 16, 17, and 1800s by people of Euro-American descent. Most, not to say all, but most people of that era and of that background, right, really had a great fear and loathing of the Dismal. And again, these words here, right, I'm just sort of pulling some of the evocative terms from her wider or longer paragraph. But right, it's a blasted region, nothing lived or moved. It's got this sort of air of lonesome solitude. Sunbeams sicken and grow pale as they glided like ghosts. It's impossible that human industry or human wayfaring should ever penetrate the swamp. No wholesome growth. Its slimy depths, a wild jungle rattling cover for venomous reptiles, black ponds, a place forbid. All right, it's a little bit melodramatic, sure, but this does, in fact, like I said, capture what I feel is a pretty common understanding, right, and fear and disgust almost of the Dismal Swamp. And remember, this is right in the backyard, right, of this increasingly and intensifyingly colonizing area and colonized area, and then later, right, areas of state development and so on after the Rev War. And these feelings and ideas lasted most of that couple centuries and a half. Again, not universal, but it's very common. Now in the swamp, right, we have, like I said, I mean, the documentation is pretty thin up to at least around the turn of the 19th century. And we see an increase, and I can tell you a little bit more of my view on why that documentation increases if anyone's interested down the road. But let's just say when you invest money in the swamp, like we'll talk about that folks did, and companies are starting to do that, they generate documents, and this sort of documented world kind of emerges. But anyway, so most of the documents that I can show you are coming from a little bit later in the period. But maroon, famously, for those that pay attention to the Dismal anyway, a maroon named Osman was observed in 1856 in the Dismal, and that picture on the upper left. There's a 19th century painting of maroons in the Great Dismal in the lower right. I don't think that's from eyewitness testimony, that painting, but it's the imagination of an artist after they heard about increasingly, right, common stories about maroons in the Dismal in the pre-Civil War 19th century. Now this is one actual written text that I did find myself, and it was probably the most informative thing I've found about particularly maroons in the Dismal, at least informed in the sense it has the most info. And I give you the quote below that you can read here, but if you'll notice, right, the desert, by the way, was the name given by people of Euro descent quite often to uncontrolled wild places like the Dismal. So don't think desert sand, obviously, in this case, think desert as a general stand-in for quagmires and places that weren't controlled and developed, right, in the but it was becoming a very typical European fashion. But in any case, right, so here you see this maroon lived out in the swamp for 13 years, came out a couple years before this piece was written in a ledger. But this information that he raised rice and other grains and made chairs, tables, and musical instruments is quite informative. And you may be surprised to come to understand that you don't see much detail like this in maroon documentation in many places, but certainly in the Dismal. And I'll probably bring this point back up about the grains as well as the musical instruments and furniture as we talk more about some of the archaeology here in a second. Okay, also from 1856, this is an enslaved worker settlement, or at least part of it. You can see the corduroy roads. That's where they transported the lumber, products of labor that were lumber from the more deeper parts of the swamp. They loaded them onto bateau or boats in the canals that were built 1763 and on. And the corduroy road there in front stretching out into the standing water front. You can notice where the people are in the building, it's dry ground, right? So back to this island thing, this the importance of dry ground. Again, we'll see more of that in a second. And this is just a color image, a postcard really, right, from about 1905, showing African-American lumbermen in the Virginia part of the Dismal. And this, other than maybe some of the technology observed there in the image, right, this is probably not entirely a lot different than what was going on before the Civil War. Groups of enslaved workers being, and I will discuss this in a little bit more detail in a few minutes, but being out in the swamp, cutting wood in groups and removing said wood that they cut, right, like I said, by way of boats and other means, to then take on to the more regional and global markets, the products of their labor. Okay, so moving to the Dismal, I'm sorry, the archaeology of the Dismal now. This is the sort of where chapter 5 really kicks into gear to describe what we found and give some of the preliminary interpretations. I'll read again a little bit here. With the large volume of data at our disposal generated from archaeological fieldwork and to a lesser extent documentary records, we can come to a reasonably rich understanding of how diasporans ushered in a new age for themselves by forming communities of a particular kind, by socializing their labor, and by extricating themselves from many or most of the alienating conditions of the CEMP beyond the swamp. In turn, these communities represented an engaged praxis among diasporans, mostly African-American maroons after 1680 or so, and also a communitized praxis that contributed directly to the emergence of a novel swamp-wide praxis mode of production, as I'm calling it, that persisted for centuries. Okay, CEMP, long story short, it's something I coined, the capitalistic enslavement mode of production as described earlier in the book. And again, try to keep it brief, but I see it as the enslaved labor, race-based enslaved labor system as being unique or different from the capitalist mode of production, or CMP. In any case, so I laid out some of the details for why I make that distinction in this book, but other publications, just so you know. I could see where that might not be intuitive as far as what I read. Okay, so the Great Dismal Swamp Landscape Study. Remember slide 2, I mentioned this is my project. Now I have the dates a little different here because this is from, the project began with archival and documentary work in 01 and 02. And by the fall of 2003, as a doctoral student done with my classes, thankfully, I was able to start my dissertation fieldwork. And these images here on this slide are from that first couple years. And you may remember, if you're from the mid-Atlantic area, at least back then, right, Hurricane Isabel roared through in 2003. And it roared through right when I really had just loaded up my truck to begin my fieldwork. And it roared right over, when it came out of the Atlantic, right over the Dismal. So it knocked down a heck of a lot of trees, like tens of thousands in the swamp or in the refuge. And it delayed my start a little bit, which is probably the least of our concerns at that time, but nonetheless. But once I went out there a month or so later, then one of the things we ended up, once we found areas of dry ground, these islands and such, it turned out, because they're higher and drier, that the trees, the canopy itself, the tops of the trees were a bit taller too. And when that hurricane came through, it knocked down a heck of a lot of trees on islands. So it became a fairly important part of my survey strategy, beyond digging, or in addition to digging small holes to find material culture of these groups of people we've already discussed a little bit, right? Also looking at the exposed soils of these tree falls, which I called tree root mass survey. I don't know why I like to coin words. It's one of those fun things, I guess. But so forgive me and all my little acronyms if that drives you batty, but they're here. And more of that. You can see how this might appeal to an archaeologist there in the dirt exposed by one of the tree falls, right? Finding 4,000-year-old artifacts in the soils where the tree grew up around them. Now, again, I'm not particularly focusing on ancient materials as such and studying their societies, but nonetheless, finding evidence of people was very important, because this is the first archaeological work to have occurred in the refuge. And so documenting any human presence on these sites and these landforms was really important in terms of letting the owners, i.e. the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, know what is out there. It also will come in, interestingly enough, into our conversation later, but for now I'll say that. And we certainly, like I said, gathered a good amount of information, even if it was pretty basic, and certainly some materials from this survey. Okay, again, more of this dry ground, and I just can't overemphasize how important it is to this history. But these are just, again, to give you that sense. To, even though we can't be there to have this conversation, let's give you a better sense of what you're looking at when you're out in the swamp. You've gone through the water and the muck and the mire, and now you come up here on these little hills and islands, and it feels pretty much like woods. Okay, now getting into more specifics here. Now, again, this is oh, hold on. Is my screen still showing for you all? Something just went different.
Still showing.
It's still showing?
You have a white screen, but you're still in the slideshow.
Oh, okay. I don't know why I did that. What did I do wrong? I didn't press anything. Anyone been through this before? Oh, what's this? I have no idea what happened there. What do you think? Should I stop share and begin again?
Yeah, maybe exit out and then restart it.
Michelle Ortiz is requesting remote control.
No.
Okay. So I'll stop share and restart. Sorry, all. I didn't do much. Something must have gone to sleep or whatever. Okay, hold on. Let's try this again. Does it look okay?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So if from the this is terrible. What the hell's going on? All right, hold on. Third time's the charm. Okay, I see you can now, let me try from current slide.
Good. That works.
Oh, okay. All right, let's hope for the best. It went dark again. What's going on, Sayers? I'm really sorry. I have no idea. This is the first time this has ever happened. You can't see that?
It was working until
Then the black screen came over it, I believe. All right.
yeah.
I wonder, was it make any sense for me to log out and rejoin? It seems rather drastic, but
I think it seems like the problem happens when you click like the start slideshow thing. So if you just kind of get it to the, basic.
all right. Just
Yeah.
so keep it where, when you first see it, keep it there.
Yeah. I
Okay.
think.
Okay. Something like that.
Yeah. So instead of doing from current slide, if you just use the column on the left-hand side to switch slides, we'll see if that works.
Okay. All right. Let's hope for the best. Okay. let's see here. Okay, so now down to sort of the two sites that I looked at in the book or explore in the book itself. I do want to say up front, I did explore archaeologically more sites than that I'll be talking about, but the ones that I focused on for the book are definitely the ones I spent in a sense the most time at and put the most effort into, which is of course probably why they appear in the book in some detail. But in any case, right, in the first few slides here of the archaeology, I'm going to talk a little bit about an enslaved company labor settlement located in that refuge in the North Carolina part of the refuge of the Dismal Swamp. I'm really kind of not allowed to say exactly where these places are for protection of resources, so please forgive me for that, but it's an agreement I have with the Fish and Wildlife Service. But it is in the North Carolina part of the refuge. But I did work in the Virginia part as well on enslaved company worker settlements and other sites. But this right here is a 1820s, actually might have been built in excavated in 1817 or so, canal. This one happens to run 8 miles, give or take, 8 miles long. So quite an impressive feat of labor and work by the enslaved workers who had to excavate them by hand. In case you were wondering or didn't know, the Dismal has its share of all sorts of interesting creatures, not least among them the dreaded water moccasin, as well as a couple species of rattlesnake. And reports from observers indicate that yes, when mostly men were doing the excavating in these projects, they had to deal with those snakes. Many died between the natural creature dangers of the swamp as well as abuse heaped on them by overseers. But overall, there's something like 50, give or take. It's actually not much take. It's 50 plus miles of pre-Civil War canal. Canals still extant or still there, either at the edge of the Dismal Swamp Refuge or within it. So this is an impressive feat, to sound detached from it a little bit perhaps, but it's an impressive and sad sort of testimony to the kinds of work these men had to do and with the rise of the canal and lumber industry or era. But once the canals were excavated, then these companies would bring in workers in groups of varying sizes to then lumber, right? So these companies had acquired property or parts of the swamp, and then they'd put these canals in or have them put in or forcibly put in. And then for the next remaining decades after that, each year you'd see for each company, right, if they lasted, if the companies last, you'd see these communities or settlements of workers who would stay in one spot and then go out, radiate out into the swamp to lumber. The lumber in this case consisted at the time mostly of cypress and Atlantic white cedar. And one of the main products from the labors of these thousands of overall men and women who worked in the Dismal, shingles, right? Cedar shingles were a big product that came out of the Dismal and certainly hit the global market, capitalist market. They got all over the hemisphere and over into Europe and so on, but certainly here in the mid-Atlantic too. Okay, now the view previously was a canal looking kind of straight down it, so to speak, west. Now here is to the right of it or to the north of it. The canal we just saw is sort of to the left. And here you see me and a couple of my advisor archaeologists standing on what would have been, right, the spoils, right? When they dug the canal, they're heaving it over their shoulders or whatever. And so along these canals at the time, then you'd have these sort of these essentially parallel strips of spoil, and those became, as far as I can tell, roads or at least pathways that paralleled those canals in most cases. And sure enough, I did find quite a few ancient materials and artifacts coming from the soils of this road that we're standing on over the years. Okay, and why would that happen? Why would I find those artifacts? Well, it turns out where we're standing is actually in the middle of an island, all right? So back to those islands. So this canal was cut through probably the largest island I've found or archaeologically explored. It's about 40 acres in size in total. And the canal went through the northern quarter of it or so. So most of the island is south of that canal, so to the left. but nonetheless, right? So the enslaved company workers, as far as I can tell, and what I would predict, right, when the companies or they built settlements, they built them near canals. So I did not expect them to be too much further than say 300 feet from a pre-Civil War canal, right? These settlements, and sure enough, everywhere I looked, at least we found evidence of settlements, yeah, much closer than even 300 feet. Such as this in the next slide. All right, this is located maybe 30 feet south of that canal. And I just happened to find this by expanding on a small little exploratory unit I excavated. But what you see here, right, is just a section, a small section of what surely was a larger building associated with this enslaved company labor settlement. The dark soils really represent, right, the rotted out parts of the structure, as well as just organic stuff that happens when people mix soil up and they drop things like food and anything else in the ground. So archaeologists, as archaeologists, we definitely get interested when we see the darker soils in a situation like this that contrast, as you can see, right, with those more tan soils to the right. But in any case, all of this is a cultural sort of feature. Even the tan soils, there's still stuff mixed in there, material culture and so on. Okay, and so what was so interesting? Well, we started finding, it was sort of like, all right, here's an 1817 or 20 canal. And okay, we're looking in tree falls south of it, and I find a little chip of a little piece of the paint from this vessel. I mean, little, like the size of your pinky finger. And when I expanded on the unit, I found, I think it's about 100% of this bowl. This is only one big piece of it, but overall, we recovered almost the entire vessel, if not all of it, in little fragments, plus this big one. In addition to this, this particular bowl, right, you'll see in a minute a few more artifacts, but it was part of a larger garbage. Well, I'm sorry, let me rephrase. It's some kind of area that artifacts, as we call them now, were concentrated. I don't think it was a garbage dump per se, but I'll talk about that in a minute. Okay, but alongside in that same dark soil, we recovered lots of nails on the order of hundreds. There's a few of them. We recovered some definite datable to the 1820s, 30s, right? Glass, in this case, a little on the right is part of a molded, which is to say decorated, designed in the mold itself, whiskey or liquor flask made of glass. On the left is a small, probably a medicine bottle that would have had alcohol in the medicine, air quoting here, medicine. Okay, but it's found in this jumbled sort of mess of other material cultures, such as the bowl and its fragments, the nails, and so on. Overall, we recovered several hundred artifacts from that little area. It was about a roughly 9 by 9 square meter area. So 25, 30 feet by 30 feet at the most. And that ultimately when we completed excavations. Artifacts also included animal bone from meals. They had knife cuts and so on the bones. A variety of iron objects, some of which I couldn't identify, including a few knives though. Gun flints, right? Other glass fragments, and then even a couple fragments of locally made tobacco pipe. I would say the dark soils represent a structure like a crew bunkhouse, for lack of a better word, that burned in place at some point in the pre-Civil War period, or so I argue in the book. The artifacts seem to have been concentrated in that area I looked at, that you saw a little bit of, and may represent a storage or possibly a surreptitious, that is to say, secret stash location inside the structure. That worker structure, as we found with some of our excavations, was built over an older 1600 to 1700, that's roughly, by the way, occupation area, which was itself settled on top of a pre-contact or a fairly rich prehistoric occupation area. Okay, so on this island, you have to imagine where we were was the highest elevation point of it on the island. I call these high points crests, just so you know, in case that word slips out of my mouth, but the sort of high point of the island. And here we have, right, sort of stacked settlement, if you will, if you think of it in terms of the soil building up. The most recent, at least in that area, was this pre-Civil War enslaved company worker settlement. Then you had this earlier but historic group, which I would argue is probably a community just like the one we're going to talk about in a minute. And then, of course, before that were the ancient settlement zones and layers, right, associated with indigenous peoples for potentially thousands of years. Okay, so these landforms are pretty important across all these millennia, and then well into our modern era. Okay, now just shifting gears, I'm trying to be mindful of time. We're getting there. In any case, right, so here we have it's a couple miles from that other site. Right now, this is a LiDAR map, light detection and ranging map. It's showing you elevation differences in those amorphous blobs that are kind of red and white you see in kind of the center area. That's an archipelago of islands out in the swamp. And the one circled is the one that I particularly focused on, that comes up in the book quite a bit, and much else besides. Okay, these communities that go out to these islands, now just so you know, the island that I was just talking about with the enslaved company worker settlement, that was about a mile into the swamp from that Nansemond Scarp that I read about in the first slide or so. Okay, these islands are located closer to, the one circled is about 2 miles in from that scarp. So the furthest one to the west here on the left is probably a mile and maybe a mile and a half, maybe a mile and 3/4 from that western scarp. Okay, there's about 1,000 or so feet between each of these islands, maybe 1,500, depending on which one you're talking about. But anyway, the circled one is what I was focusing on mostly. And if you can see my cursor, this little white area right here on the circle island is actually the crest, right? Is the high point of this particular island. And I worked there quite a bit. I'll mention that again in a minute. Okay, just some images of us working ourselves to uncover this history and explore these people's lives through the archaeological record. So from a few different years where I took students out there in the summer, not all of them were from AU, but it was done through AU because I'm faculty there. But in any case, right? So this one on the upper left is taken on that crest, that high point, and the one on the lower right is taken in a different part of the island. Okay, so here we are about 12 to 15 centimeters below the ground surface. Okay, and we're at a place in time at about 1600 or so. Most of that tan dirt is about that age, and all the dark soil you see in the back is a post 1600. Then, right? It's coming in, but it's being intrusive or intruding into those soils. It's dark soil, like I mentioned. It's something to do in this case with human beings and their activities. And that, again, the back of the excavation block, that's about 26 square meters, all the excavation area. A close-up of that back part. You can see I've put in the grid for you, but this is a post and ground cabin footprint, partially exposed. And where the lines intersect, we found, when we looked in those areas, right, we found the remnants of the posts that they put in the ground, not to say the wood, but the rotted out soil, darker soil. Okay, and those posts were placed every 2-3 feet, and they were about the size, diameter or circumference, either way, right, of say a typical dinner plate. So pretty good size posts. Okay, here we are excavating. We ended up getting a date of give or take a decade or two, 1680. On that cabin footprint through scientific means, which I can elaborate on in Q&A if you'd like to hear more about that. But artifacts, the few that we did pull out from these soils also didn't contradict that really. Okay, smaller area, but another exposed architectural footprint, part of one I should say, okay. Based on artifacts, it looks like it's a 1700, 1800 structure, but right here would be the door entrance by my interpretation. Here is the structure wall. These are cabins, by the way. Okay, here's a fire pit. We also scientifically means, we dated it to around 1630. And I'll give you the outline here, roughly that. We detected it by remote sensing, but it has the definite signature, the unique signature of a fire pit. All right, another post and ground cabin partially exposed. Okay, all sorts of material culture from this help us date it to 1730. give or take again a decade or two. Over here where you see a big root coming through, this is the outer edge or wall. And because it's darker here, I think this is where a porch was. This area here to the right, that little excavation area that's kicking out to the right. Part of the reason that was put out there was to see if we could find more evidence of it being a porch area or sitting area. I think we got it. I want to draw your attention to that area that's excavated more deeply in the kind of center of the block. And I'll give you a close up here now. All right. Now that ends up being, again, one of the support posts, but it's lined with really old ancient ceramic sherds. And to the right is Dr. Lance Green, archaeologist extraordinaire, excavating that post, or at least half of it, sorry. We usually expose and excavate half and either take the other half out later or leave it. In this case, I believe we left it for future work. And the ceramic sherds we pulled out after we clean them and get them in the lab, they all they piece together. Okay, and there's because of the type of ceramic they date to thousands of years ago, but here we find them right in a architectural or a cabin footprint, right, a post in that footprint, right, that dates to, again, roughly 1730, maybe even a bit earlier, but definitely historic. And here's on the crest of the island, the high point, the most defensible point. We found a relatively unique architectural footprint, which I've in the book argue is probably, if not almost definitely, a community defense structure. And it dates to a bit later in the range, right? We've been kind of seeing early 1600s up to the 1730s, maybe even a little more recently in previous excavations. But here we're getting much closer to that overlap with the enslaved company labor era, right? That last 100 years before the Civil War and emancipation. And here, by the way, are important parts of this. So it's kind of got this shape to it. And again, dark soils are your first clue, but then interpreting them is a whole nother ball game. And then you even have an arc here that's kicking out. But anyway, it's quite different. And most of the material culture we found could be called munitions or potentially at least community defense type material culture. So like in these pits we partially excavated, lead shot, gun flints, English gun flints, and so on, chips in particular. Okay. Again, from the more interior island, we have reworked stone tools. And when I say that, think like the ceramics. They're finding this ancient material, and I call it resuscitating, but they're resuscitating it in the historic period to use in their daily lives then. So they find an old arrowhead. They need a scraper or a knife, so they work one side of it like you see in the upper left here, right? But they leave enough of the ancient shape that we can figure out the original shape, plus realize it's been reworked here. Here's an arrow, probably an arrow shaft smoothing stone. Anyway, I won't give you all the details. I can answer some of that about dates and so on if anyone cares to ask in the Q&A. Shift glass, not uncommon in historic period sites in some ways, but in this case, looks like it's from making tools out of an old piece of glass, which makes some sense, be quite sharp, as we've probably all experienced, right, with broken glass. Okay, and then a 19th century iron and copper decorative item, like maybe something on a necklace or something like that. We found something kind of similar more recently, Lance Green did in particular. Okay, but this is the item in question. This is the bead. I think this is an arm, but it might be like a nail that's rusted and corroded to that bead. Okay, and most artifacts were recovered. This is kind of important, but we're really small. So some ways these photos are biased in two ways. One is towards larger artifacts, and the other is towards this sort of mass-produced material culture, stuff from the outside world, right? Like the green bottle glass fragment you see there, the lead shot, the gun flint chips, white clay tobacco pipe fragments. But most of what I found across over 250 square meters of excavation at that remote island that I had circled on the LiDAR map, right? We worked in several areas, but most of what we found was super tiny, micro, right? Real tiny, and very hard to photograph with any definition, but still, you know, it was numerically anyway, the large, by far, the vast majority of what we found. And part of that is because these communities, right, as I'll explain in a minute, right? It was that's the smallness, the micro size of the debris they left behind in those sands there, right? Reflects a bit of that community structure and how they lived day to day out there and did their continued their resistance and acted out their praxis. Okay, so we're getting near the end. I know I'm running a bit long here, but I'll be as quick as I can. I know we have some time for Q&A. So in the last chapter, what I end up providing is some ideas about really 250 years of diasporic society and history out in the Great Dismal. I end up making a case that even when you include the kind of intrusion of capital or in the form of the canal lumber profit extraction industry, even when you include that after 1763 or so, you still have this praxis mode of mode of production. Sorry, I have a lot of modes in my head. Mode of production, right? That emerge and persist in the swamp. It does change, but it's still there. And certainly central to this praxis mode, right, is the people that went out, the maroons and the indigenous peoples and others who joined these, particularly in the interior, which was 95% or so of that swamp, that 2,000 square mile swamp. Most of it was interior, especially in terms of accessibility, right? Those people that went out there, they were doing it out of a critique. They were doing it because that racist, brutal, outside, oppressive, alienating world outside, right? They didn't want much to do with it anymore. And so they went out, their critique of that world compelled them out there. They found like-minded people already living on the islands or who came out after them, depends on how you look at it, right? And then they, of course, cohered as a group and as communities, and then those communities persisted across, as I've argued from archaeological evidence, multiple generations, in fact, for 250 plus years. Okay, so even on one island that I looked at, I kind of had this sort of sense from the data that we were looking at least 250 years of pre-Civil War resistance community, scission as I call it, because they're cutting themselves off from that outside world as much as it's feasible. And even with the rise of the canal company era, right, they're compelled a bit to begin trading with agents of the outside world, namely the enslaved laborers. And so some of that outside world material gets into the community. And we found some of that, as you saw in the photos, like the white clay tobacco pipes, and glass, maybe some of the gunshots and so, or gun flints and shots and so on, right? But still, it's this thriving world with potentially thousands of these islands, right? I only visited and excavated at maybe 8 or 7, but in that 2,000 square miles, there's potentially thousands and several thousands of small to large islands that people would have found and would have inhabited. Okay, including enslaved company workers later in this 250-year era. Okay, so in this chapter, I bullet pointed here for ease of reading here on your end, but nonetheless, right? Like I said, I think thousands upon thousands of people lived out in the swamp between 1607 and 1863. They lived permanently in the interior areas of the swamp before and after 1800, right? So the beginning of that canal era, canal lumber, did not eliminate these resistance communities who thrived on, right, their self-removal and continued self-removal and avoidance of that outside world. We see these scission communities as well as the enslaved labor communities emerge, and we now know this from archaeology with certainty. Each kind of community, you might have noticed a bit of a difference. Maybe I didn't pick the right photos, we'll see, but they did use overall remarkably different kinds of material culture. Just a few common sources between them, like perhaps a few nails here and there in the interior, some gun flints, but mostly what we saw with the tiny artifacts and what people are using in the interior, it was lithics, it was swamp available material, and so on. Okay, we know that I've argued, I should say, that trade systems emerged among these kinds of communities. I also made some arguments in the book about how the interior communities in particular formed around group labor, right? As opposed to individualized or even enslaved labor, where people are isolated based on being owned as people, and certainly not as wage laborers, right? Where your labor power is purchased by a capitalist, right? But they worked as a group. And maroons across the hemisphere did this very regularly. So it's not uncommon in these kinds of resistance communities. They particularly when it came to subsistence, which is to say getting food for themselves in the community, they had some kind of group organization to those efforts, as well as making a material culture perhaps. And they were organized potentially by kinship system, kinship ordering and rank systems, different kin groups occupying different parts of the islands, probably relatively egalitarian, but some may have had different statuses depending on what they did in the community and how long their lineage or kin group had been there. Okay, they were interior in particular groups. Those islands and places were heavily populated till 1800 or so. I think the populations decreased a bit with the rise of the canal era, but I don't think they were eliminated. They, like I said, probably almost certainly, really, I should be more definitive, multi-generational across that, that 250 years. And I want to bring home a point here as I wrap up, right? The reuse and resuscitation of ancient material culture was particularly critical to the lives and labors and work of the interior community. So not only in its persistence, but its kind of reproduction every day, how it continued to exist day in and day out. Those ceramics we found and stone tools, a few of which you saw photos, right? They found these out in those islands, right? And they pull them out of the ground. That's the sort of, in a sense, the resuscitation part I mentioned. And then they work them with whatever skill they have. And now they make something hopefully they can use today from something an ancient person left in those same soils, or at least that same landform. Okay, but interestingly as well, like the ceramics you saw, I did find what amounts to potentially still useful tools on occasion, right? In the cabin foundations or footprints. The photo that I pointed to, the worked edge on one of them, that would be one example. That was a perfectly useful tool in its way, and it's not clear from a functional or practical point of view why that would have been let to drop into the soil and never recovered. And I make arguments in the book that this was actually more of a recognition, this intentional placement. They used most of the tools they found. They whittled them down to nothing almost, hence why I'm finding all the very small material culture. But every once in a while they'd rework something, and then it has a little bit of them and a little bit of the ancient people in it, and they put it in the soils of the foundation of their cabin, reflecting a kind of unalienated understanding of our connection or their connection with people of the past. Okay, and then last point down here, right? I do explore a little bit about some of the transformations I see, right, in that 1775 to 1810 era in particular, but right that persisted after some changes right up to the Emancipation Proclamation. There's no doubt the canal company labor communities and really the canal companies themselves really did have impacts on the interior communities as well as the lives of the enslaved company workers, obviously, but nonetheless, right? So I did trace a little bit of those changes, and one of the things I explored in detail as things go in this business, right, was the informal exchange economy or trade system that emerged among company workers and interior communities. And so given that I'm running long, I was going to say a little bit, but I'll just let you get a sense here. We in the academy, but also in archaeology in particular, perhaps it's very important to most of us that our work do something, have some meaning beyond what a few colleagues might think through a peer-reviewed journal or whatever, or at a professional conference. So me, as well as the people who've worked on the project from many disciplines, have worked pretty hard over 20 years, not to say perfectly, but we've worked pretty hard, right, to get the word out about this history in various ways. I could describe some of that in more detail if you're interested here in Q&A, but nonetheless, it is an important place still to tribal groups in the region, the Nanseman tribe, for example, but the Meherrin as well in North Carolina. And it's certainly important to a lot of folks who have contacted me and descendants in the Suffolk and Chesapeake region, descendants of those who worked along the canals, among the communities of workers there, as well as potentially, right, maroons and others who lived in the interior. We've certainly, the project has helped the Fish and Wildlife Service better understand what they need to protect in terms of resources. Students have learned quite a bit, obviously, about this past, this history, not only in my classes, but certainly coming out with me to the swamp to learn archaeological methods. We've helped with public interpretation, such as at the refuge here. You can visit, anyone can visit this anytime. It's open. Open. It has a roof. It has a roof, but it's open. In more recent years, we were able to get some of the artifacts and the story into the new National Museum of African American History and Culture down the street from AU here on the National Mall. And even more recently, Senator McEachin is working with us on this Dismal Swamp Collaborative Group, right, to formalize its recognition as a national heritage area. So thanks to him, of course, and his staff and colleagues for doing what they can to help, again, protect the history and the resources of the swamp. And there's a quote from Senator McEachin there on the bottom. And my last slide, mercifully at 8:10. So sorry for running a bit long all, but anyway, thanks to Will and the Virginia Worker Editorial Board for the invitation. And you have the list of the many folks who have helped me one way or another in the project, as well as funding groups. And then I wanted to be sure to verbalize a thanks to Elaine Nichols, Hugo Leeming, Herbert Aptheker, and the several other scholars, right, who've done so much work on this history and help pave the way for this work that we've tried to do with the Great Dismal Swamp Landscape Study, as well as other people doing their own work naturally. And then finally, I always, in my mind, I'm doing this work in honor, respect, and recognition of the Indigenous Americans, Black Maroons, and Black enslaved workers of the Great Dismal Swamp of 11,000 before the Common Era, all the way up to the Emancipation Proclamation. So anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that very elaborate presentation. Tons of data to have to process there. So yeah, if anybody has any questions, please feel free to type them in the chat box and we'll read them off as they come in. We already had someone ask one as you were wrapping up here. They wanted to know if the book goes in depth about how these people work together to destabilize plantation society and other horrors of colonization.
What goes into depth? Well, in a manner of speaking, yes. I would say that by exploring the lives of actually both communities here that we discussed, right? When you have what amounts to potentially thousands of people removing themselves, right, from the conditions of plantation and farm enslavement by marooning, right, permanently. And then you have people in that last 100 years or so, and I can elaborate here just a little bit on some areas of this history I didn't have time to, but right, enslaved workers for these companies, there was something going on here that was a little unique, at least as far as I know, in much of the mid-Atlantic. And what was going on in particular was, and this may have crossed some of your minds, well, if people were marooning, why would enslaved workers go in the swamp and just stay working? Why wouldn't they just maroon? And surely some did. Okay, but they had to build in incentives. They wanted their lumber, they wanted their profit, etc. They needed people to work, and putting people out in a known haven of marooning with some of the, shall we say, typical conditions and abuses and exploitations and so on, right, was probably not too effective. So what we know from a lot, like I said, in the 19th century, we get a lot more documentation. And so it turns out that one of the systems that emerged pretty quickly was a quota system. And so what happened was more, especially those doing the lumbering and living in the canal settlement, canal labor settlements, they would be rented out, right, by the companies from their enslavers in the world outside. They'd go out for, say, a year on 1 year sort of contract. And the deal was they have to produce X number of shingles, say 250,000 or whatever. After that, they would get paid money, okay, actual cash in theory. And it turned out in practice, at least on some recorded cases, they were paid. The companies did good in that regard, to their words. So this became incentive for people, right, for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is earn money to buy your own freedom or buy a loved one's freedom and so on. But they would go out in the swamp. Plus, it gets you away from that world. So, and put in this position where, as far as I can tell, right, there isn't a heck of a lot of supervision, unlike, say, overseering on the larger plantations and on smaller farms, having your enslaver right there, right, always kind of near you when you're working. In this case, supervisors, if they were there, probably stayed in the settlements, as these small groups of 5 or 10 went out in the swamp and lumbered and so on for days on end, coming back with their shingles. So in any case, back to your question, or wrapping back into that, in my mind, it's this praxis, it's this critique, it's this between the maroons going in for their sets of reasons, and then you have these workers who okay, there's something here, right? I can play this a little bit in some ways, and they went out and across that century, numbering in the thousands, right? Earning, not everyone, but when they got their quotas, those that could meet those quotas, then they were paid money, and sometimes they could do this year in and year out, and year in and year out. For Moses Grandy famously did do so, but there were others as well. So in any case, right? So I see both of these undermine that system by kind of simply put, removing laborers, right, from that system, but also probably equally important, right? It allows people to act out their, like I said, their kind of critique of that capitalistic enslaving world out there, right? Not only by living in the swamp permanently, but also by going and working, earning wages, right, and potentially buying themselves or, again, loved ones and so on. So this was a challenge. And when you read, when one reads, I should say, right, the newspapers and the documentations of various kinds from, 1650 or 1680 on, what you find is that enslaving world, right, was terrified quite regularly and often of maroons of the Dismal and resistance people out there. They had a million different names for, some of them pejorative, some of them perhaps slightly more just descriptive, but nonetheless, they were terrified. And so in any case, right, their presence away from that world actually had an impact on that world in terms of what enslavers thought and the slaveocracy thought and their fears. It even influenced how they reacted to Nat Turner in 1831 during the insurrection, right, where it was assumed he went out into the Dismal to rally the troops as they would see it, right, the troops that Maroons would become, right, under his leadership, as they stormed out of the swamp and killed all the white folks, the countryside. So in any case, it had a lot, and the literature can give one some insight depending on what you're looking for, right? How this history impacted that world beyond the swamp.
Great. Josh is asking, what caused the dispersion of these communities in the post-Civil War period? Further canal construction and intrusion of extractive industries? Are there narrative accounts of former community members, perhaps oral histories and descendant communities? How do they integrate into external society?
Great question. When it comes to the swamp interior communities, there isn't a lot in terms of the written record about sort of people seeing folks come out, understanding that they came out to rejoin, or writings from them themselves, right, that would give testimony to it. What I would say is when at the site that we looked at here in this talk tonight of the interior, I did excavate quite a bit, right? A couple hundred square meters, 250 square meters, or give or take. I'd have to look in my book. I do mention in the book, I just don't have numbers. In any case, for archaeology, it's a pretty good amount. And in all that work, right, as I'm digging from where my feet are on the ground and I'm going down 1 inch, 2 inch, 3 inches. 3 inches about where I start getting into 1860, or if it's not disturbed, right? And then deeper, older. So in those first 2 inches or so, I found virtually in most cases no artifact or material culture or even feature evidence, right, from the post-Civil War period. Okay, every once in a while, a 20th century artifact like a Coke bottle, sure, right, a fragment from somebody from 1960 or 70 that went out to one of these islands, but there is no archaeological testimony, right, to a continued presence much after, anyway, 1863 or so. Okay, so that led me, in part because we don't have a lot of documentary records or oral traditions that I'm aware of, which there's a big caveat there. Okay, that's a big asterisk that I'm aware of. Even though I tried to find folks that might impart some of this family and community history to me. Because we're kind of, I see sort of a minimal or even an absence of evidence. What I have long suspected was that between the Rev War pulling some folks out because of the British Emancipation Proclamation, all right, the 1870s, and then the Emancipation Proclamation 100 years later, right, is going to potentially draw out some more folks, right, who say, okay, you know, things might be changing out, whatever their reaction would be to that. But certainly by 1863 and after, you're not having probably new people with the same kind of critique coming into the swamp. So I think people, some just stayed there and lived out their lives and passed away, right? Others left. There may have been things that we wouldn't be able to detect that compelled them to leave a little bit later. Hard to say. But what we don't have a big evidence of is whole scale, like say, logging, right? That suddenly overtook the swamp in 1880. Now there were big pockets of it, right? But that's kind of been a defining feature of that swamp all the way going back to 1763. So, right, if they're lumbering here, you move here. So if people were persisting across the post-Civil War era, even if it's just talking about the last half of the 19th century or so, I would expect to see some evidence of it. Doesn't mean it's not there, but I haven't seen it, and then it's not in the documentary record that I remember too much of. Hugo Leeming, one of the historians I mentioned, he does cite one source from the 1930s, 20s or so, if memory serves, somebody who recalls seeing communities of African Americans that emerged on the swamp edge, probably that Nansemond Scarp in the rural areas there. They emerged on the edge, they stayed together. They kind of clustered as looked to the outsiders as sort of like families. And they kind of had this sort of community approach or communal approach to their lives, right? Their agricultural lives on that scarp. And that sounds, yeah, that makes sense that would happen, but it is only one source. And I wouldn't hang a heavy hat on that anyway. So if more of this kind of comes to light, I think a lot of us would be very excited and intrigued, right, to see more evidence of what happened after, say, the Emancipation Proclamation. But until then, what I would say is, yeah, people either left in the generation or two preceding or coming up to the Emancipation Proclamation, or they stayed in and then within a decade or two, they passed on and lived out their lives. Yeah.
Sarah was asking if you came across any human remains in this process.
No, none at all. And that's quite as you can imagine, I've been asked that question in various ways across the years. So no, that is, as some of you or all of you may know, I mean, that's exploring human remains, think skeletons and burial, the soils around them, right, is quite a specialty, as a specialized area. And you have to be obviously trained in it. And I am not. I've taken classes, but that's kind of know enough to be dangerous kind of scenario. But yeah, I don't have the requisite skills. Doesn't mean we couldn't do it. I could, of course, bring someone on board who has those skills, and it could be part of the project. So in the end, I didn't actively seek such evidence. I know a lot of folks are quite interested and in evidence that comes from skeletal analysis and bioanthropology and so on. And of course, it is quite potentially fascinating and informative. I mean, it would have a lot of meaning to descendant communities, no doubt, of various kinds, right? Depending on where you find, where one would find such remains and so on. I do have some ideas personally of where such things might be found in the swamp, but yeah, in that case, even with my little hunches about it, I avoided those areas.
Someone was asking if pirates were out there as well in that area. Is that correct?
Well, that's a good question. And I haven't thought of pirates in years, but when it comes to the swamp, hold on. I'm going to pause for a second because pirates did come up. It's been a handful of years since I read something. What did I read? there's a lot of legends and such about the Dismal. There's a lot of mysteries about the Dismal, Great Dismal Swamp. I want to say that there's probably some legends of pirates, especially when you think of the swamp going as far as really, I mean, for all practical purposes, the Atlantic shoreline, right, back in the day. So Virginia Beach and all the way down to the outer, almost to the Outer Banks, right? So you get past the beach and start walking in a little bit. In those days, you're going to start walking into the muck and mire of the swamp. In any case, I have a feeling at that way eastern part of the swamp is probably some pirate stories, legends, whatever. But I am not thinking quickly of any documented like the kind of thing, say, a historian might write about as actual history, as opposed to say something like folklore or legend. But I don't doubt it. I know, knowing in general, pirates were in that area regularly. It wouldn't surprise me at all, like I said, especially at that on the eastern edges, and maybe from underneath James River, but also from the Albemarle Sound down there, coming up into the swamp a little bit along those spits and little peninsulas that you might remember from the map. Yeah, but I can't tell you anything in particular, unfortunately.
Krista says that they're descended from people from the Maroon River, if I'm saying that correctly, Gates County area, and their great grandmother told family lore of them running George Washington out. Is there any truth to that? Is there any Maroon history that relates to resistance to Washington?
Well, it's interesting. Gates County, I've spent a lot of time working there, in the Dismal part of the Gates County, and there is oh gosh, right in one of the areas I work, there is this thing, 50 acre or so spot, I should say, not a thing, in the swamp. It's called George Washington's rice field. Even on some of the 1980s and 90s maps that I saw, anyway. And I talked to, I got a hold of a historian probably 15 years ago now, and he wrote a little bit about it. And unfortunately, there weren't a lot of sources cited in his book. So I was writing him a bit, not to like pick at him, but just sort of, hey, do you by chance know of any sources, right, that talk a little bit more about Washington's role in North Carolina, particularly, but also this rice field that has his name on it? And he didn't, unfortunately, have any sources. So in the Gates County area, about any truth to anyone running George out, I wouldn't say I could know either way. I know his name is attached to something in the swamp. I know they're out on just outside the swamp, there's a historical marker having to do with George there in Gates, and I don't remember all the details of what it says, but I remember stopping and reading it some many moons ago. So he's certainly in the area, and his rice fields certainly smack dab in the middle of a canal company property, all right, known historically, and near a canal, actually. What I do know is George Washington was definitely present way up in the thinking Gates County, up in the Virginia part, right, of the swamp. There are images of him. He was there in the 17th. This is before the Rev War. He was there in the 1760s. He invested heavily in the adventures to drain the Great Dismal, was their title, a kind of proto corporation. They brought in enslaved workers. There's Washington's Ditch up there in the Virginia part of the refuge. It's the oldest canal in the swamp. And that's 5 miles long. In any case, he was there. His, oh gosh, wasn't brother, was it? Brother-in-law, John Washington. Both those two men, plus a handful of others, right, kind of ran this enslaved company-based project, enslaved labor-based company and its projects in that 1760s period. So I wouldn't doubt there is some connection between people who lived in the swamp and either literally or just sort of in a sense running Washington out, and maybe his fellow investors, like doing something to the company, doing something that made the company not as profitable as they hoped or whatever. I could see that. It's just not recorded that I know of.
Ryan asks, has your research ever intersected with the history of industrial exploitation of the swamp? For instance, their understanding is an agricultural firm Washington held a majority share in, intended to acquire drain portions of the swamp for farming. So are there any indications of how these industrial forces may have interacted with the indigenous and maroon populations of the Great Dismal Swamp?
Let me think here. Yes. Some of this is how much time do we have, and others, but I'll go the short route if I can. Okay, so when you're talking about the 1800 and later, we have as things go anyway, we have a pretty good amount of information. And it's a whole different part of this history that I didn't quite mention yet. But when you had the rise of the canal and lumber era, part of when you go back to what I said about the quotas and making shingles, okay, this was not obviously, I don't mean to impart at all. This was an act of generosity or anything like that on the part of the companies. They put an unbelievably high quota up there, like the goal, right? For one person to make X number of shingles in X amount of time, that number by any accounts was very high. So how did they get those? And that's what observers started wondering. How did Ishmael or whomever it was, right? And these are names I'm pulling from actual documents of enslaved company workers, right? Or Jethro, or a few other names that come to mind quickly from those. How did they actually make 500,000 shingles in 6 months? That doesn't seem possible, they would say at the time. Well, it turns out that once the canal company workers go in and become a permanent part of the economy and social world of the Dismal, and they become even a defining force of it, maroons who would go in the swamp, at that point, they had another alternative. Okay. Instead of going deep in the interior and giving the bird to the outside world and living in a very different kind of social world and mode of production, like I discussed a little bit of, right? They worked surreptitiously alongside these enslaved company workers, and they helped them make those shingles. Okay. And the company workers then exchanged things. I doubt it was cash too often, but trade goods and so on. And in that regard, then these maroons became quite well known as it goes, right, to companies and company investors and so on. Probably the closer people were to the operations, the more they heard, but nonetheless. In fact, that account of the maroon that I mentioned many slides ago now, but who went in and made the musical instruments and chairs and so on, that comes from the Atchison and Parker account book. Atchison and Parker were part of that, I believe, if I'm not misremembering my history of these corporations, but I believe they were part of that original adventures to drain the Great Dismal. So they were probably very familiar with George and John Washington, right? That initial company, and then several others emerged in the 1775 and later period. But in any case, so what we end up having is this rich, relatively rich documentation, right, of social complexity exchange along the canals, and that are related very expressly and directly to the rise of the canal and lumber company work. I've seen supervisor and overseer ledger entries, right, where they're showing a lot of curiosity about some folks they know about in the swamp. The Bear Quarter gentleman is referred in one, and the impression is that these might be some of those maroons who were that were out there helping the enslaved company workers proper make their quota of shingles and whatever, pine tar as well as turpentine. There were some other products as well. Cooper barrel staves, right? They made a few things, but nonetheless. Anyway, so long story short from here, the industrial approach to the swamp, there's certainly it's a big part of this history, and really the fact that it's only 10% of its original size is a testimony to the effectiveness of it. It did drain the Dismal, right? Eventually, especially the Dismal Swamp Canal, it cut the swamp in half. Basically, the water flows out, hits the canal, and goes down. All of Chesapeake, everything south of Norfolk, everything inward from Atlantic Beach, from Virginia Beach, and then even Elizabeth City and so on, everything can kind of emerge in the farmland, right? Because that swamp gets drained and then lumbered off and so on. So yeah, but that's not all entirely, but much of that is post-Civil War history. Much of that's even 20th century. Okay. Not to say all, but much of it. And so one of the things we had in our project was I had a couple of researchers do some more work on the 20th century. I didn't do it for my dissertation work and really much of my work to date, but there were some students as well as a colleague who were quite interested in what happened during the 20th. And it became very clear from their research to me what I kind of suspected, but really they detailed just how much, right? This 1880 to 1950 period, right? How much that impacted and helped shrink that swamp, drain it, eliminate it, develop it, right? To use the uneven geographic model kind of developed language, one way or the other.
Charlie was curious if there are any efforts for this information to be taught in the local public schools. As someone who graduated from Suffolk Public Schools in 2019, they were never taught about maroon communities, let alone the community at the Dismal Swamp.
That's a great question. I couldn't necessarily say that I know of concerted efforts. There might be. I've talked personally, I'm just speaking for myself. I have talked to many people by phone, by email, in person, and whatever, a variety of means, that had connections to schools. It's not so much to say what I've done. I'm just thinking of what I can attest to here. I know that I've worked with people to develop K through 6, I think it was, or in that, not all those grades, but in that, somewhere in that age group, right? Teaching materials. But that wasn't necessarily Suffolk, although I think at least one case it was Chesapeake. But we have this collaborative going that might be 2 years old now. And there are a lot of folks, a lot of different sort of interests, all of which center on the swamp, of course. But a lot of those folks are very interested in this history and the archaeology too, but certainly the people and the history, right? And so I've seen a lot of sort of people taking what they can gather, right? They may not be out there excavating, they may not be out there doing archival research, but they're taking what's been published or what's been presented on a podcast or online or whatever, and I know they're putting together educational type materials. And again, I couldn't even necessarily send a link, but I know it's happening. And I get emails, like I said, even if it's not someone asking me to contribute, they're letting me know it's there. So any case, I just agreed the other day, actually, given that it sounds like you're still in the Suffolk area. So in October, I'll be talking with the Suffolk historical group about this. It'll be a different presentation in many ways, but nonetheless, and that should have folks from the wider Suffolk community, based on what they told me, right, who might have connections to that school, the school system, in which case, yeah, hopefully for my part of that, I could make inroads into seeing about getting this into being part of the academic conversation.
Josh is wondering if there's any evidence of conflict with either the canal companies or surrounding communities.
Conflict. There's some of the written resources about life in the canal company settlements do indicate there were times of conflict within groups, just within the canal companies themselves. And there was also some conflict when, again, this is just one or two written sources where enslaved company workers, for whatever reasons, would basically tell on one of the maroons or a couple of the maroons, and at least the implication was they tell the slave catchers, so-called, right, and they go catch this maroon and do what they do with them. If we're talking conflict, like armed and whatnot, it's interesting because again, there's a lot of this I can't cover in a day's conversation, much less a couple hours, but there's a whole history at the swamp edge, which is kind of backstory to why interior and canal adjacent matters. That's not the only reason, but there's also a third sort of element, which is this sort of swamp perimeter. So if you think of about a half mile or less in, right, from that sort of sylvan wall, as I called it, but the wall of trees on the scarp there that goes in, and maybe along the peninsula coasts and so on, a half mile or less is about what I suspect was the kind of place that people could go live. They could keep 1 foot in the outside world, and then they could go further into the swamp if danger arose, but they could settle right there on that, what I would call the perimeter. I bring this up mainly because what we start seeing in the 16 might be a bit, no, 1680. And then certainly by the early 1700s in newspapers, right? Always a decent source of info, even if a bit biased from time to time. We start seeing reports, right, of they call them banditti, but they are maroons or people of where communities and groups of which maroons would be involved, right? But they're on my best interpretation, they're living on the swamp edge and they are going out occasionally, right? This is fairly common in other situations like this around the hemisphere, but they would go out occasionally to the countryside and yeah, they would, not only would they take things, steal things, whatever, from at least the owner's point of view, right? Take things back with them and so on. But there are also little whispers and mentions of actual violence and conflict, right? Not on the order that I've read about, say, like of Nat Turner's insurrection, but little moments where they did in fact cause fear and panic or cause some bodily harm of one sort or another to, say, an individual family member at a farm or a plantation. That's a little more rare, but the pilfering, again, from the owner's perspective, and so on, that's kind of what quite often is the crux of these little blurbs, right? But it's also that sort of that fear mongering thing that newspapers love to do now, but they certainly didn't shy away from then. And it helped create this sort of legend almost based in fact of the Dismal Swamp being full of these banditis and so on. But anyway, so if I had an hour to think it through, there might be other specific moments, but I would say that compared to other places that I know maroons and resistance communities thrived, the conflict evidence is not as strong here as you might expect. It's there, like I said, these little examples. There is conflict with enslaved company workers within their groups as well as against maroons who helped them. I don't think all of them. I think it was personality clash type stuff or whatever. There's not enough of it to say it was a pattern as far as I can read. But anyway, yeah. And then you'll hear, if you pay attention, if you haven't already, and in previous time here, but now that you've heard this, you might hear people talk about so-called slave catchers going in the Dismal, another kind of form of conflict in my mind. And I don't think even though you will hear it from some local historians, you might hear it from other sources beyond that, but I don't think there's a lot of evidence for it. I don't think people went in there. And if they did, they were going into the canal company settlements and looking for people that didn't belong, but they weren't going deep in the swamp. There's no way. So anyway.
It would seem like this area would be somewhat inhospitable for, agricultural production or anything like that. What kind of agriculture, if any, was going on there?
I think a lot of it's that rice, rice and grains, things you can either grow in the standing water with the sort of community labor system that I'm pretty sure was in place, or you might see a little bit of this sort of intentional draining. If you had to grow, you could grow something in semi-saturated peat, but you couldn't do it in standing water. I could see both. I think George Washington's rice field, my personal theory is that it's still there. I've walked into it. So it's definitely something that was very intentional. Like I said, 40, 50 acres in any case. I think that was actually George Washington's name was attached to it. I think it's a much older. I think it's a maroon community rice field. So that was on that island. The enslaved canal company that was 40 acres in size. It's not particularly far from there. And I think that community that was there from 1600 to 1820 developed that George Washington's rice field. But in any case, yeah, so I think and then last thing to round out the answer. On these islands, I think then they had gardens, and this is a well-attested fact in maroon and maroon and indigenous communities anywhere, but certainly even some whispers of it for the Dismal. And yeah, they'd be little either kinship group gardens, whole community gardens, or both. So those islands were 20, 30, 40 acres. They're putting cabins kind of in nucleated groups probably, and then they have these spaces that they They grow the cotton, they grow the gourds, they grow medicinal plants as needed, right? And probably other things I'm not thinking of. But in any case, so yeah, they had these, I think at least two approaches. One is the big fields for bulk food, grains and so on. And then the smaller gardens for.
Is there animal husbandry? Any evidence of that?
Good question, and one that I would have predicted at the outset. I may have, I can't remember now, I have to look, but yeah, that you would see that, right? A reliance on the beasts of the swamp for food, for clothing, for companionship, who knows, right? But out in the swamp, I can't attest to anything that the documents aren't too clear on that, because no one's really giving us a documented insight into how the swamp looked and what these communities look like. That's why part of the archaeology is so important here. If you care at all about this, that's why the archaeology is important. What I would say is that what I would have expected to find archaeologically, because we find it at every other modern era site, are food bones, like we found at the Canal Company site, right? So cow, pig, chicken, whatever. Could be any host, as you know, right? Of food that animals they would have killed and butchered and so on. Archaeologically, we find that quite a bit, and you probably all know this, but we do find it quite a bit at our typical sites, and quite often it's because of the fact that it was cooked, right? And so the bone preserves in a variety of soil situations. So not to get too boring about it, but like I said, 250 plus square meters of excavation, almost all of it around homes, post and ground cabins, a couple fire pits, this kind of, maybe even some garden sections. The number of bone fragments I found was something like 5, and they're all about that big. Okay, so not exactly the bounty I'd expect from 250 years of heavy reliance on cooked animal protein and flesh and everything else, right? No bone tools, on and on. So I'm going to say this, which is no. When it comes to the interior, the evidence I have says no. And I'm not going off a deep end here. It's every other site I've ever dug at that's historic. We find them in the trash dumps and the fire pits. We scattered around yards, people eating, throwing stuff, whatever, even if they're precise about it. And I dug with we screened with window screen size holes, right? The stuff on your front door screen window. You're going to catch almost everything. So even if they're throwing the big bones out in the swamp, and I didn't find them because I'm not digging out in the peat, I'm going to find the little fragments, right, all over the place, of bones breaking, of spitting it out when you chew on it, whatever it might be. So we didn't find any of that either at that granular level. So I would say yes, not enough's been done, and another shovelful, you could find a whole pit full of that, and boom, now we have our answer. It goes opposite what I'm saying. But right now, I would say for the interior, no. Not much evidence of food reliance or even husbandry. At the enslaved company worker settlement, where we dug far less, we already found hundreds of animal bones. So that's a little more typical. And must be a connection to that outside world connection the enslaved company workers had.
Charlie asks, he comments, he says, from the little reading they've done about the Nansemond tribe, the Dismal Swamp seems to have been mostly hunting grounds and not a living space. Has your archaeological research shown that, or that pre-colonization, that there were communities living within the swamp?
Well, what I would say is, trying to think of particularly Virginia here. Give me 1 second. What do I know from the Virginia sites? So in the Virginia sites, I did explore the island sites that I looked at. There were a handful. It was far less work on my excavation area on my part, but I would say what I was able to suggest in my reports was that it looks like there is potentially a presence, 1600, 1500 to say, I'm sorry, let me be less confusing, from roughly 1500 to maybe 1700 of people there on these islands that are probably either swamp edge, swamp perimeter communities, because it's very close to the swamp. It's within that half-mile buffer, most of what I'm thinking of, right? But what I didn't, so I found artifacts that I'm pretty sure confident date to that range. So before Jamestown, but certainly with 100 years or so after 95, 100. They could be related to the Nansemen for sure. I would rather them tell me that than me tell them that, but yes, I think it's possible. But what I don't have evidence on the flip side is for extensive settlement in that for the in the Virginia part in the perimeter. Doesn't mean it's not there though. That's the caveat, because I didn't excavate as much. So if I really was looking for that and the perimeter settlement became a focus, say, then I might be able to answer that question in more detail. But as it is, yeah, there's some material culture evidence for a presence. What I can't tell you or anyone really is just how intensive and expansive that presence was. Yeah.
Would you be willing to go a little bit more in depth on the difference of the mode of productions that were operating there beyond just like your standard CMP?
Oh, sure. So the way I see it, okay, excuse me, inhaled by Jewel the wrong way. Let me take the capitalistic enslavement mode of production. Okay, now that is, we can even see it with examples from the swamp, right? You have these people, George Washington et al., right, who are elites. They control a lot of wealth. They want to invest it and make more wealth, right? But it's all based on enslaved workers instead of, say, wage labor, at least at that beginning. It really throughout. I wouldn't call the quota system wage labor, for example, precisely. By any stretch, really. So what I see anyway is that you have with the CMP, you have this race, white supremacy and race-driven mode of production, right? That feeds the African diaspora. It feeds the labor regimes, right, of this mid-Atlantic for many generations. The people themselves as workers, that part of them which is worker is owned, but their whole person is owned. The products of their labor, right, are taken from them quite often, at least the majority of the things they make. They are producing quite often things from those plantations and farms that feed the wider system and mode of production that is out to make some profit one way or another, and again, generate more capital. And of course, then we have the interconnectivities between that CEMP at that level, for sure, as well as the capitalist mode of production emerging in other parts, right, of the country. That's more straightforwardly capital driven and increasingly industrial and industrial labor dependent, but also a little more broadly wage labor dependent. So there's articulation of CMP, CEMP for sure at several scales at the more granular level, and the way what people were dealing with on a kind of day-to-day level or in the neighborhood kind of level, right? They're working, they're owned as entire commodities, not just their labor time or labor power, and the products of the labor, just like under the CMP, are still taken from them. Right. And so you have a mode of alienation that is, I mean, it's alienation, but it's a particular historical form that takes under the CEMP vis-a-vis then, or compared with CMP, which is the more classic kinds of versions that Marx and others inspired by him have so well documented, explored. But now then we go into the swamp in this praxis mode of production. You know, the thing that I see is you have part of what I do in the book is I end up arguing that, of course, people that go in the swamp are coming into it from a variety of experiences in life. Some, particularly later in the period, later in that 250 years, are coming from the CEMP for sure. Others are first generation, say African, or certainly people born into indigenous modes of production. And so I end up using the scholarship of, say, specifically Eric Wolf in his Europe and the People Without History, a very famous book, recommended highly to everyone, from 1982, I think. But in any case, he ends up doing a global view of sort of the rise of this historical era in capitalism. One of the things he ends up arguing and pointing out, right, in particular with North America and even some examples from the mid-Atlantic part of that world, right, are the various modes of production, right, that seem to characterize, right, indigenous communities and eras, right, throughout that couple hundred years that he looks at. In any case, he talks about the kinship mode of production and a few others from indigenous milieus. And so I end up arguing that, well, you're going to have people coming in across 250 years into the Dismal that are bringing experiences from, say, kinship modes of production, if they're coming from indigenous communities, say in 1607 or 1620 or whatever, or they already existed in the swamp. Maybe they're already there as of 1607, right? So we don't really have a begin point here. In other words, that we can concretely say no one was there before 1605 or 16. So anyway, there could have been existing society, social groups in the swamp when the first sort of post 1607 person went in from indigenous communities, but then people who were particularly first generation African, potentially bringing in quite a bit of experience of their homelands and the way their communities worked in those homelands, right? And they're going to apply those to this new situation. When I'm talking about in this case is, how do you grow things? How do you make things? How is labor organized? Who does what? What are the rules, officially and unofficially, formally, but probably more likely informally, about expectation? Who, what age, right? What ages do you start doing community labor? What age, is it age 1? Is it age 5? What age are you doing things that aren't so much direct labor, but you are contributing in other ways? If there's any age. So you have a lot of different ways, a lot of different intersections of these variables, not to sound too detached about it, but whatever aspects of life that might feed into the creation of this a new mode of production in the swamp. And it's defined really in part by the swamp landscape itself, because it is a bit impenetrable to those who are afraid of it, because people aren't leaving and going out and being agents of it necessarily within the CEMP or the CMP, right? It's kind of there, and it is impacted by other modes of production, but it is also very much its own, right? And it's just like every other mode of production is going to have articulations with others, but you can concretely point to kind of a center of it that it's unique. So in this case, I decided that I was very impressed by these people's praxis, because I believe, and again, this is not fact as much as what I see here. I can see in the ground out there people's critique of the outside world right there. This is not guesswork, and this is not trying to do like archeo brain reading or consciousness, finding. It's there. I have no other way that I can get myself to see it. It's, you go out there and you're living in a world with those blue bowls and the gunshots and the white clay tobacco pipes and all the clothing and all the other things maybe we did or didn't find pieces of. And you go out there and suddenly you find yourself living in a world where you're making cabins out of the swamp available materials. You're resuscitating, right, ancient stone tools and modify them to do something today. It's not store-bought. It's not made with anvils and so on that you might find on the plantation, right? It's all stuff you're making with your skills, but you're doing it because you came out there because you wanted to give the bird to the outside world. And that motivation, every one of them, every person that joined had some form of it, right? At least after 16, like I said, roughly 07. So everyone's kind of, and then of course they feed off each other when they come together, meaning people grow, people change, people transform a bit in terms of their beliefs, their consciousness, and really how they relate to one another. And so anyway, that's why I argued that the praxis is the defining thing here. You could call it, subsistence mode of production. You could call it whatever, and none of those would be wrong. But what I decided here was, this is the first time in all my years of excavating that it's not that I found a moment or two where I would say that's praxis. Yay. It's, wow, this is a whole society to, social world defined, or at least has at its core, right, the engaged praxis of multiple generations. So anyway, that's the 3 modes in particular, plus some nods to kinship mode and others that you see in the book and that I've been kind of thinking about for a handful of years now, for sure.
So what was the state of Virginia's policy to this? Like, was it just sort of like, obviously they wouldn't approve of it, but did they ever try to raid it, get rid of it, just ignore it?
Yeah. Well, let's see. I want to say at the state level, boy, that's a good question. there was, it depends how you look at it. There are in government documents, like the kind you could probably find at the Richmond Library, right? If or the archives anyway, for sure at the archives. The state papers from 1822, those leather bound volumes that you might run into. I know I've looked into the like probably years of interest, 1810 or 20 all the way to Civil War, and there are moments where everything here is illegal. First of all, meaning marooning and all, it's definitely on the books as illegal. Now, then the question is, how much does anyone care? There's a lot of stuff that's illegal that you don't enforce, or you do, right? And they do enforce, obviously, across the mid-Atlantic landscape, across the Virginia landscape, very adamant, like every other colony that enslaved people as well as state, adamant about runaways. They went after them when they could find them, and they recaptured them, and they punished them brutally quite often, as I think we all know in varying ways from our knowledge of history. But when it came to the swamp, I know what I sensed. There was certainly by the 1800s, there was quite a bit of general knowledge that it existed, to the point that Harriet Beecher Stowe is writing a fictitious novel based on it, as of kind of toward the eve of the Civil War. There, you have like the images I showed you of Osman and whatnot. 1850s, right? People are going into the swamp along the canals. They've already heard about the maroons of the Dismal. So it's well known. And you got painters, romantic painters, who imagine sitting in their chair in Texas, like what a maroon out in the swamp looks like. And so it's kind of, it's out there as an idea and an understanding that it's there, right? And so that politicians of the time are not exempt from that. They know, they're aware as well. And so I do remember reading various acts and so on that specifically mark the Dismal, right? And then there becomes this whole issue of runaways in the 1800s with the rise of the canal company, meaning some did run away. So one of the things that happened was, laws were enacted in and Nat Turner had something to do with this too, but in the 1830s, Nat Turner's insurrection or revolution. When you were enslaved and then you went in to work for one of the canal companies after, I do want to say it's the late 1820s into the 1830s, it intensifies. You then suddenly have to go to the courthouse, like Gates County or Suffolk or whatever. You have to go into the courthouse and you basically appear before somebody like the judge, and somebody records every bit of they can about you, your description, your height, how many teeth are missing, what scars you have, generally describing everything they can about you. It's the closest thing to a fingerprint they had. And it was sort of and it's legal, meaning it was part of the legal world imposed on these folks, of course. But so in the spirit of what you're asking, at that level, right? So it's not state as much as county, but it's state recognized. That you had to be recorded to go in. So if you tried to run away and maroon, at least that's been what most people understand this being a reaction to. But you got to think, if in case you're ever wanted by the law for any reason, but certainly marooning was top of the list. At least they have this description of you. Or if you just go wandering, right? Maybe not marooning out in the middle of the swamp, but you just decide you can make a life going up and down the canals. There's 50, 60 miles of this, right? Dart off into the swamp when you see someone coming. So you can imagine then these enslavers and then police and maybe even some slave catchers going out with these descriptions from the courthouse when someone is believed to have done something illegal or marooned. So in any case, so there's definitely this more organized legal recognition along the way. I don't know how early that goes. I couldn't trace it to an exact year where the first government documents generated on it. Some may have, and I may be forgetting. I know it comes up in 1700s, like Governor so-and-so mentions the Dismal of the Maroons, but I don't know if it's like a legal thing. I can't honestly remember right now if it was like an edict of some kind or what. But in any case, but that just kind of goes into the Civil War, right? So you just have this sort of sense that if it is illegal to maroon, and yes, I imagine anyone who wanted to could try to go in and try to track down maroons and so on, but no one, I don't think many did.
Molly was saying that the practice as critique is an interesting idea, and how does that square with people leaving the swamp after the Emancipation Proclamation? That you had already said that you weren't sure why people left, but what are the implications of them leaving on that idea?
Well, I think the implications would be something like the critique really had a lot to do with specifically, not to say exclusively, but at the core of it was this critique of the labor regime, one way or the other, right? I'm not trying to put words in anyone's mouth here. I imagine this was thought many different ways and even different languages across those years, but it was sort of it was central. And I think when you have the Emancipation Proclamation, and then really the cessation of the Civil War, and the promise, so to speak, of the elimination of slavery, race-based slavery, but slavery in general too, this might have been enough to bring people out, because okay, now I don't know if they would have then turned around and said wage labor sucks as well, and I can't guess that. I'm going to say if they're like anyone else, they're going to eventually say that too, but they're going to have a different perspective on it as well, owing to their experiences. But yeah, so that's sort of where I've always, I mean, I've thought that you'd kind of think the other potential is, in a sense, I'm devoted to this, regardless of what's out there, in a sense. And maybe some stayed that were, but I do believe, like I said, those that stayed and then maybe just expired due to age or whatever else, right? Maybe that was it. But I do think some went, like I said, I know we know at least from documents, 400 people from the Dismal Swamp area were recorded joining the British at Norfolk there when the British announced their Emancipation Proclamation. I don't doubt that some of them were maroons from the swamp. Others were people that marooned from, right? They ran away, so to speak, from their enslavers in their swamp region and went straight to the British. But I think some among them were probably maroons, not to say 300 of them, but some. And then you have yes, with the emancipation. And I think, the one thing we got to remember, and it's very easy, and you probably do, but I, as an archaeologist, have to remind myself, we get so caught up in these almost silent things like artifacts and soil and patterns and stuff, but bringing things in that bring the voices and the images, right, is always a wonderful thing in some sense. And, when I'm sitting here thinking of this world, I think of the grapevine, right? That it had to exist, the information trails, right? That went in and out of the swamp. It probably changed over the years. Again, some of it had to do with canal companies coming in and those workers and so on. But even before that, when it was just either inside the swamp edge, or in this enslaving world, right? Probably that swamp edge range of communities and settlers, they probably had a lot of impact on the information that people deep in the swamp got and received, right? And then what information, if any, really left the swamp. So anyway, I think grapevine knowledge of the Emancipation or Civil War Emancipation Proclamation, or the earlier British one, right? It probably got into the swamp pretty quickly through that grapevine, for lack of a better word.
Charlie was wondering, is it hard being a Marxist in academia?
In a way, yeah. I think, if I can be frank, I've found that I just have to not give a rat's derriere about what people think. There are so many interesting ideas floating around academia now, and I think, not to say I embrace them, but they are interesting from a sort of detached intellectual point of way or so on. But the Marxism, I think it becomes more about who listens to you, as opposed to threat, in a sense, or whatever. So there's this more subtle threat of being ignored, which is, of course, not good for an academic, traditionally anyway. And here's the thing, and I forgot to mention this earlier, slide one. When I can count on 5 or probably not as many as 10 fingers, how many self-identifying Marxist historical archaeologists there are. Okay. There aren't many. Now, there were a few pioneering voices, so to speak, and thinkers in the 70s and 80s. And even one of those who I'm thinking of did mostly pre-contact work, right, in the Southwest for a long time. But yeah, there aren't many. And I probably know most of them personally. And but I know of them because they've had a decent amount of success getting their views out through traditional academic publishing, conferences, obviously, and then other means. So there's room for it. And in many ways, one of the folks I just mentioned, not by name, but he came to my university maybe 10 years ago now. Might have been 8, but anyway, he said so. He might have published this as well, but he said it there, and that's my memory here. He said one of the powerful things about archaeology, and I'm paraphrasing, of course, is that it's so under people's radar. People do not expect anything remotely, even within 4 degrees of revolutionary, to come from archaeology, right? When he says people, he means not only archaeologists, but most people, members of the public, your family members, mine, they're okay. That's neat. You're digging out in the dirt, and here's a neat object, and and what you see on TV. God, most people think of Indiana Jones, I guess, still, at least of a certain vintage, like such as my own, right, age and so on. And anyway, he's like, yeah, it's one of the most important things to remember about archaeology is just how, like, kind of guerrilla it is potentially, right? To use this as a means of helping, right? Not raise, I think it's a bit presumptuous, but can continue to feed class consciousness and related consciousnesses from a Marxist perspective, right? And challenge ideologies, pernicious ones, but really all ideologies as we go as well, plus other things. But those 2 aspects come up a lot in our ideology and consciousness, modes of consciousness. So in any case, yeah, I don't know. I think it's so far, I'm knocking on wood here. I would say more. Yeah, it's like, well, okay, you're going to kind of get ignored a bit, maybe, in the profession, and I can deal with that. Some people might not be able to, it bother them or whatever, but all right, whatever.
Well, it's been about 2 hours now, give or take, and I think we're probably coming to an end here. I'm sure you're tired. Just want to thank you for this very elaborate presentation here and answering folks' questions. And I'm sure everybody's very appreciative of you to make this time and volunteer to do this for us. So thank you again.
Yeah, and thank you. This has been great. And for those who are still here, there is a lot of stuff from this project. If you didn't get a good sense, or you want more of a sense of certain things, just you go online, and there are some films we did. There's a Smithsonian Channel episode that's not too old. It gives you a good visual, active, brings in other voices too that are part of this project or doing their own work. So it's not just me here, and so on. So there's just stuff out there. There's a TED Ed video you can check out. It's on YouTube and such. It's sort of thinking more about youth, but it's good for any people of all ages. It's like 5 minutes. So anyway, there's stuff out there. So I'd urge you to look at it to the extent you're interested in, and you see if there's more. These things, like, even though it's 2 hours, I mean, I didn't cover a lot of stuff we being me, and I'm sure questions will come to your mind as you go on here in the days and weeks to come. Oh, that'd be neat to know. Well, maybe it's out there. So just word of the wise. Yeah, you can check that out at your leisure, and feel free to reach out to me. Sayers@american.edu. Just go to American U Anthropology, and I'm there, and shoot me a line. I'll answer more or send you into certain directions if you want to know about some resources. I'd love to, actually. So just let me know.
Great. Well, thanks again. And, stay tuned for the next Virginia Worker event.
All right.